let's talk about Dr. Fauci.
Yes. Okay. A new Senate hearing is accusing Dr. Fauci of squashing the lab leak theory in order to hide some ne'er-do-well activities funded by his labs in China. That's basically what this is about. This is from a new Senate subcommittee report. It's called the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic. This report was released just on Sunday, and it's a bit meandering, so I want to try and simplify it for you. So what they are alleging is that Dr. Fauci and his colleagues, Dr. Francis Collins, those two, worked together to keep the COVID came from a lab theory from getting out because they did not want it to be known that the U.S. was doing forbidden things in said lab. Here's the report so you can see it for yourself, and I will link you to it in the show notes as well. The report says that on the 1st of February 2020, at least 2 physicians warned Dr. Fauci that the COVID pandemic may, this is a quote, may have leaked from a lab in Wuhan, China, and further may have been intentionally genetically manipulated. Okay. This is what 2 doctors said on the phone to Dr. Fauci. This is February 2020, when none of us really thought that COVID would affect our lives. We just thought it was something that Asia would have to deal with. And he is being warned that COVID may have leaked from a lab in Wuhan and may have been intentionally genetically manipulated. Now, a few days later, some physicians on the call, some of the same physicians on this call, authored a paper in the journal called Nature Medicine about COVID's origins. Here's the journal. It's called The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2. It was published in March 2020, and the authors confidently conclude, see what I highlighted there? Our analysis clearly shows that COVID is not a laboratory construct or a purposefully manipulated virus. Nope, nothing to see here. Now, how did they know this in March of 2020? How did they make such a quick decision when the pandemic had barely hit us yet? And why did they come to that conclusion just a few weeks after being told that there is some credible evidence that it may, in fact, have come from a lab? Why? Why those things? Well, the Senate is trying to find out why. And the Senate paper finds that Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins had been given a chance to see the draft of this paper. The report also finds that Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins influenced the paper, along with one other guy. This is Dr. Jeremy Farrar, who is now chief scientist at the World Health Organization. Okay, so these 3, keep these 3 in mind, Farrar, Collins, and Fauci, were some of the doctors who were asked for this paper to be written. In fact, one of the authors, Dr. Christian Anderson, actually told the journal when they asked for permission to publish, they said, here's the email. This paper, because of the speculation about COVID, was prompted by Jeremy Farrar, spelled it wrong, but it still was in the email, Tony Fauci, and Francis Collins, among these other doctors. Now, Dr. Anderson, the author, also told the journal a few days before that they had a theory. They had a no lab leak hypothesis. This is from an email on February 8th by, again, Dr. Anderson. Said, our main work over the last couple of weeks has been focused on trying to disprove any type of lab theory. Now, this is where, the scientific process comes out. So it's good to talk about it, especially with Philip, who has a biology background, because you're allowed to have a hypothesis, right? Sure. You can have a hypothesis.
Yeah.
And
it's
say,
encouraged in science.
Right. And so, but is this an appropriate hypothesis trying to disprove? Because Philip says this a lot. You can't prove a negative. So
yeah.
Would we call this an appropriate hypothesis by scientific standards?
Well, if you're doing an investigation, which it sounds like they're doing, like they're not scientifically looking into this, they're just doing a flat out investigation. Mm-hmm. And when you're doing an investigation, you don't start with the answer and work backwards.
Yes.
It's if you're trying to find out what happened, that's not how it works.
No. And so this does not seem like an appropriate hypothesis, and it seems like a foregone conclusion based on who was asking for it. Now, here is Dr. Marty Makary testifying to this Senate subcommittee just a few weeks ago, pointing out that this doesn't make sense. The timeline doesn't make sense. Who's saying what doesn't make sense. And there is corporate interest here where the doctors who said this looks like we have evidence of a lab leak and a genetic manipulation, those doctors all of a sudden stopped saying that and then got a bunch of money from the NIH. Listen.
Thank you, Congresswoman. The reason this is even an issue is that it's embarrassing we funded the lab. If we had not funded the lab, 100% of Americans would say this is obvious, this is a no-brainer. The epicenter of the world is 5 miles from one of the only high-level virology labs in China. The doctors initially were arrested and forced to sign non-disclosure gag documents. The lab reports have been destroyed. They've not been turned over. The sequences reported from the lab to the NIH database were deleted by a request from Chinese scientists that called over early on and said, delete those sequences we put in the database. And 2 leading virologists, maybe the 2 top virologists in the United States, Dr. Michael Farzan from Scripps and Dr. Robert Gary from Tulane, told Dr. Fauci on his emergency call in January of 2020 when he was scrambling soon after learning that the NIH was funding the lab, they both said that it was likely from the lab. Both scientists changed their tunes days later in the media, and then both scientists received $9 million subsequent in funding from the NIH. It's a no-brainer that it came from the lab. I mean, at this point, it's impossible to acquire any more information, and if you did, it would only be affirmative.
Okay, so there's conflict of interest there. There's scientists changing their tune. There's scientists coming up with a foregone conclusion in an investigation.
Right.
How much this pins to Fauci is still open to interpretation, but we're going to get there. The Senate report also addresses how the paper's authors seemed interested in this zoonoptic angle, that COVID is from animals, and then, they sort of were interested in the lab leak theory, and then they were not. And then they were all in on zoonoptic. It's interesting, but it's a little in the weeds, so I'll leave you to that to read it yourself. Finally, about Dr. Farrar. Again, he's the shiny new WHO chief scientist. Here's the news about his appointment to this position just last December. So this is interesting, right? Because someone who works inside the WHO has decided to conclude, because the WHO just recently said, we're done looking into the origins of COVID. We couldn't find it. We're going to move on and prepare for future pandemics. Well, that's interesting because someone who works there now was involved in this paper disproving the lab leak so early. So the Senate says that Dr. Farrar worked on this paper, but was not credited as an author. But in fact, there's an email involving Dr. Farrar, and here are his final edits to the paper. Here's an email that he sends, and he says, hi, sorry, can I just micromanage a little bit? But let's change this from it is unlikely that COVID emerged through laboratory manipulation to it is improbable. Those are, I think, pretty big changes. That's not a micro edit. I would say that's a macro edit.
And based on what? Right? It's unlikely to improbable. Again, again, there is no smoking gun here, right? There's not been one specific thing that they're pointing to. Like, where is the specificity here, the evidence? But you're not saying, well, and they're not walking it back either in the same way.
Right. And I don't want to parse words, but I do think that unlikely is a much stronger, improbable is a much stronger word. Like, he wants it. And even there's evidence in this paper that Fauci was not happy that it didn't shut down the lab leak enough. So it does seem like he had a dog in this fight for a conclusion that he wanted. Now, we talk a lot about how these Senate committees are powerless because they can't prosecute anybody. They can say, there's newest headlines today where Republicans are saying prosecute, send him to jail. The report is light on Dr. Fauci, but it shows us important insights, namely that Dr. Fauci and his merry gang of doctors were hiding something. And it very much does read like a mad scramble to disassociate themselves with something they were doing that turned out to be dangerous. Otherwise, why would they hit so hard on this no lab leak conclusion? Why would they care?
Right.
And this plays into the anti-China rhetoric that we feel ramping up right now, because if they can turn up the volume that it was China, then politicians are doing the bidding of Dr. Fauci, saying, well, it wasn't us, right? Like,
Right.
yes, we had some interest there. We did some like really benevolent science, but the Chinese did it. Yes, the Chinese are the bad guys. We didn't do any of the bad stuff.
And the thing is, like, this has actual real world harm in creating this, like, when you think of like the bats in the market story, I mean, like, to what that did to sort of like paint Chinese like people as like backwards and so then you look at like all of the kind of like anti-Asian sentiment that then built up in the United States during COVID because of all of this stuff. Like, it was because of them that did it. And when it really, it's like, it's not like this story was just like, oh, we're trying to cover this thing up. It literally had real world harm, and real people lost their lives because of it.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and the extension of that, right? The lockdowns and all of the planned movements around with people and passports and schools and everything else. I'm wondering if Fauci's really gonna be the fall guy here, like, because the timing of this is so amazing, right? With all of this anti-China movement right now, CNN today publishes an article. Literally, the headline says, the war in Ukraine was the perfect opportunity for the United States to isolate China. So again, all of these things are pointing to us trying to isolate China away from trading partners and everything else. And if we can really like pin Dr. Fauci tied to this, he's the fall guy. He knew about it. He's confirming it. We've got it confirmed now.
And the Chinese let him.
And we're done. And now we've got to go to war with China.
And the Chinese, they had to know because
let's send some more warships and don't do trading with China. Let's undermine them as much as possible using these stories. We even saw that Chinese crane story today. Instead of Chinese balloons, it's now watch out for the cranes that are building buildings.
Yes.
Watch out for those cranes.
That was in the Wall Street Journal this morning. That the Pentagon now says that China is using shipping cranes that like pick up the shipping containers.
And they're surveilling us. The shipping cranes are now attacking us.
How do they? I don't go there.
I don't know.
I bet that ukulele that fell on your head was made in China.
Might have been.
Yeah. So whatever's coming out of your mouth right now must be Chinese propaganda.
Yeah.
Yeah. State-controlled Chinese propaganda ukulele bonked to the head.
Okay. Well, unrelated to this paper, but I think it's another interesting bit to come out of the Senate subcommittee is how now physicians are starting to agree that the mandatory one-size-fits-all COVID vaccination has eroded public trust, and now parents are starting to mistrust all vaccinations. And if that is the case, then what this committee is concluding is that this is a major fault of public health policy and no one else. We'd have no one but ourselves to blame. Watch Iowa Representative Marionette Miller Meeks. She is a doctor talking about this.
In essence, we vaccinate people in order to develop immunity. So very early on in the pandemic, certainly by the time the Delta variant came along, we already knew at that point in time that infection-acquired immunity, if we had looked at real-world evidence, which we in the Doctors Caucus and we on members of this committee asked the FDA and CDC to look at, we would have acknowledged that there was infection-acquired immunity. It was valid, but yet our message to the public was that you're mandated to get a vaccine. And I think, as you've alluded, this eroded trust in our public health communities. And I can tell you, as a former director of public health who has good relationships with all of my county public health directors, and in Iowa there are 101, even though we have 99 counties, they felt that this was a misstep by the CDC and a misstep by the FDA. So can you expand a little bit on infection-acquired immunity, the validity of it in SARS-CoV-2, and then whether or not we should be acknowledging that in children, placing SARS-CoV-2 or COVID and vaccines on the recommended list for vaccines will, I think, hurt most of our low-income, impoverished children, our Head Start programs, as Dr. Joyce had mentioned.
Yeah, by forcing children to have a vaccine that they don't need because they've already had the disease, that undermines the trust in other vaccines, like the measles vaccines or the polio vaccine, and that's very, very serious. I think during the last several decades, we have the the never vaccinate people or the anti-vaccine people have tried to undermine the trust in vaccine, but with very little success. But the vaccine fanatics who wants to vaccinate every person in this country, even though they are children who has very little risk for it, even though they have already had the COVID, that has undermined the trust in other vaccines enormously, creating enormous vaccine hesitancy.
So not allowing their provider or physician to determine the risk and the benefit.
Yeah, and also people themselves, because people know that about immunity. We learn that in school. People know that if you've had a disease, you are...
It wasn't until I came to Congress that I found out infection-acquired immunity was a novel concept.
Yeah, I guess we knew about it since 430 BC of the Athenian plague until 2020, and then we didn't know about it for 3 years, and now we know about it again, so...
We have a little bit more time. Do any of our other witnesses want to comment?
Wow.
Yeah.
What?
I mean, I want to echo what Dr. Kuhler said and the seriousness of this. The putting the vaccine on the childhood schedule, this vaccine where there's deep distrust, essentially sends a signal to the American public that these are equivalent to the polio vaccine, the measles vaccine, the DPT vaccine, all of which are absolutely essential for the health of children. If putting this on the childhood schedule decreases the uptake of those, then we will look back on this as a seminal mistake in American public health.
Thank you so much.
So what he's saying is we could literally have a resurgence of polio because we made such bad decisions about the COVID vaccine that people are thinking, well, maybe I should go for natural immunity to polio or something, right? That's not how that works. And so... I mean, that's crazy. And he says, she says, I didn't know that, natural immunity was something novel until I came to Congress.
Yeah, it's amazing. He's like, yeah, it was something we knew about for 300 BC.
Yeah.
Right?
And then suddenly from 2020, we didn't know about it. And now we know about it again. And that's crazy to think that, just to think that all of these other diseases we've already eradicated could come back because of this politically driven decision to put the COVID vaccine on the suggested schedule of vaccinations for children.
It's unbelievable. Yeah, it's shocking, and we're going to start to see more of these chips fall, I think, in the next couple of weeks and months as these investigations unfold, and we'll see what we get from some of these lawsuits as it relates to Pfizer and Moderna, and we continue to peel back the onion on these FOIA requests and these Freedom of Information Act requests, and we're getting more and more information from great journalists on this. So thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.